Let's consider this quadratic equation. X squared minus 4 equals 0. Now we know how to solve this by factoring, right? This is a difference of squares, so we know how to factor this. We get factors x minus 2 and x plus 2. So either x minus 2 is 0, which means x equals 2, or x plus 2 is 0, which means x equals negative 2. So we know what the solutions to this equation are. We know that they are x equals 2 or x equals negative 2. But we've just spent quite a bit of time just thoroughly steeped in solving polynomial equations by factoring. What would a 7th grader do confronted by this equation? Someone who didn't know anything about solving polynomial equations. Someone who had just seen a tiny little bit of solving linear equations. Well, their first impulse would be, well, we'll add 4 to both sides. X squared must be 4. And now I want to take the square root, right? Because that's what the square root does. So someone who had a totally naive approach to this problem might think that the solution is just x equals 2. But wait, x equals 2 is a solution. But we also have this solution, negative 2. What happens? The square root of 4 means the positive number that when I square it gives me 4. So even though 2 squared equals 4 and negative 2 squared equals 4, the square root of 4 is just positive 2. What does that mean? That means that when we square something and then take the square root, we don't get our original number back. We get its positive version back. The square root of x squared isn't x. It's the absolute value of x. All right. Now we need to think about absolute value equations again? No, because these always work out the same way. If I have an equation that says that x squared equals 4, there are 2 possible solutions. Either x is the square root of 4, or x is the opposite of the square root of 4. This property has a name when we state it in general for any number, not just for 4. It's called the square root property. The square root property says if x squared equals some number, then either x equals the square root of that number, or it equals negative the square root of that number. Be aware of this symbol. We're going to meet it several times. We will read this symbol as plus or minus. And whenever we see this symbol, it always indicates 2 solutions, or 2 values. Plus or minus the square root of a means positive the square root of a and also negative the square root of a. That is, I could rewrite x equals plus or minus the square root of a as x equals the square root of a, or x equals negative the square root of a. All right, so there's something nice about this. And the nice thing about this is this works even if a is not a perfect square. So that means, for example, I can now solve the equation x squared equals 7. Using the square root property, if x squared equals 7, x equals positive or negative the square root of 7. That is, x equals the square root of 7, or x equals the negative square root of 7. I'm going to give you one of these to try, just using this property. Solve the equation x squared equals 64. Actually take the square root if this is a perfect square. Pause the video and try this now. Alright, the solutions to this are x equals plus or minus the square root of 64. Now I want to know if 64 is a perfect square. So I go to my calculator, I hit second and then the squared key to get myself a square root symbol, and I punch in 64. I see that the answer is a whole number, so 64 was a perfect square. Its square root is 8. I can give this as x equals plus or minus 8. And notice I stopped writing square root after I took the square root.